far as this past decade is concerned in relation to video games, the teens decade was a wonderful time to be a fan of video games in general. We got to see the release of the PS4 and the Xbox One back in 2013. The PS4 ended up becoming one of the best-selling game systems of all time. But if we look at the game systems that came out back in the early teens, 2013 specifically, we looked at the games that came out on that and previous generation consoles, you see that, there were some pretty cool DC games, some pretty cool Marvel games as well. But some wonder whether or not DC had better games than Marvel did during the teens decade. And just looking back at some of the big games that came out during the teens decade, we got Injustice Gods Among Us, which came out back in 2013. We got Injustice 2, which came out back in 2017. We got Batman Arkham City, which came out back in 2011. Those were all huge games that were commercial successes. And you look at like some of the games from Marvel that came out back in the early teens, such as the Captain America game from 2011, and then you got the Deadpool game from 2013. Those games were all solid, but they were nowhere near as successful as Batman Arkham City was following its release in 2011. That is considered to be one of the most popular action-adventure games of the teens decade. In fact, some would say that Batman Arkham City, in terms of quality and overall presentation, was pretty much the DC equivalent of Marvel's Spider-Man game for the PS4 that came out back in 2018. Now, as far as movies are concerned, it seemed like, for the most part, Marvel has been more dominant in terms of having bigger movies, because I remember back in the early teens, like, one of the few, movies that was a big deal that I remember was Batman Dark Knight Rises, which came out back in 2012. And as far as popularity is concerned, at one point, or about a decade ago, Batman was probably the most popular superhero in the world, and it seemed like recently things have changed, and it seems like at the moment Spider-Man is just as popular as Batman was over 10 years ago. And a lot of it's due to how successful some of the Spider-Man games have been. The one from 2018, the one from 2020, the Miles Morales game. And then we got a new Spider-Man game that's supposed to be coming out in 2023 for the PlayStation 5. But for the most part, like, Marvel has had like bigger, more successful movies, in my opinion. You had the Avengers Endgame, which came out a few years ago. You had the two Deadpool movies from 2016 and 2018. You had the Captain Marvel movie, which came out back in 2019. It seems like, as far as and you also had the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I think one came out in 2014. The other one came out, I believe it was, I can't remember, sometime during the mid-teens. But for the most part, we have gotten more mainstream Marvel movies that's captured people's attention. But when you look at the gaming side of things, it didn't seem like Marvel started to gain more momentum until like the late teens onwards. So as far as which entity had better games between Detective Comics and Marvel, that's something that's subjective, because there are more people who are fans of DC and Marvel than Marvel, and vice versa. And it seems like at the moment, like, Marvel has the upper hand over DC as far as movies are concerned and even video games are concerned, but that's just my personal opinion. Things could possibly change during the course of this decade, because we got the Black Adam movie that's supposed to be coming out next year in 2022, and then we got another Batman movie that's supposed to be coming out next year in 2022 as well. So things could change as far as film is concerned, all that stuff, in terms of popularity, and maybe, DC might end up becoming slightly more popular than it's been within the past couple of years or so. But did DC have better games than Marvel did during the teens decade? Maybe in quantity, they did have better games if you look at the two Injustice titles and, Batman Arkham City. But as far as games that were highly successful, that ended up making an impact and achieving, mainstream success and and just becoming very big and much more popular than expected. Marvel had the Spider-Man game from 2018, which managed to sell over 13 million copies on the PlayStation 4. In fact, it's the second best-selling video game on the PlayStation 4, and that's probably one of the most successful superhero video games of this past decade, if not all time. So, in terms of quantity, it seems like Detective Comics, Batman, and the characters involved and all that, they've had more or better games in terms of quantity. But as far as which side had, I guess, the best video game or superhero video game within the past decade, that would probably go to Marvel with the Spider-Man game from 2018.